Stop believing that Native Americans lived in perfect harmony with nature. That's a lie that's been hurting indigenous people for centuries, and here's why. The noble savage myth is one of those ideas that sounds nice on the surface. You know what I'm talking about. The idea that indigenous people were somehow pure, innocent, spiritual beings who never fought, never had complex societies, and just spent their days meditating under trees. It's everywhere in movies, books, and even school textbooks. But this romantic fantasy has done more damage to real indigenous cultures than most people realize. And today we're going to break down exactly how this myth started, why it spread, and the real consequences it's had on millions of people. Let me paint you a picture of what most people think when they hear about indigenous cultures. They imagine people living in small villages, taking only what they need from the earth, speaking in wise spiritual sayings, and basically existing as these perfect environmental guardians. They think there was no warfare, no politics, no complicated social structures, just simple, pure people living simple, pure lives. But here's the thing. This image is completely made up, and it was created by European philosophers who had never even met an indigenous person in their entire lives. The whole concept started back in the 1500s, when Europeans first started encountering people in the Americas, but it really took off in the 1700s with a French philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This guy had this whole theory about how civilization corrupts people and how humans in their natural state were basically perfect. Rousseau never traveled to the Americas. He never spoke to indigenous people. He never studied their actual cultures or histories. He just sat in his study in Europe and imagined what these people must be like. And then he wrote about it like it was fact. He created this fantasy where indigenous people represented everything that Europeans had lost. According to him, they were free from greed, violence, and corruption. They lived in this pure state of nature where everyone got along and nobody wanted more than they needed. It was a beautiful story, but it had nothing to do with reality. The truth is that indigenous cultures across the Americas were incredibly diverse and complex. Take the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois. They had a sophisticated political system that inspired parts of the United States Constitution. They had complex laws, democratic processes, and a detailed system of checks and balances. This wasn't some simple tribe living off the land. This was a powerful alliance of nations with detailed governance structures that rival anything Europe had at the time. Or look at the Aztec Empire. They built massive cities with advanced engineering, including Tenochtitlan, which had a population larger than most European cities at the time. They had schools, hospitals, botanical gardens, and a complex legal system. They practiced agriculture on a massive scale, using innovative techniques like chinampas or floating gardens. These weren't simple people living in harmony with nature. They were building empires with infrastructure that would impress us even today. The Inca Empire stretched thousands of miles along the western coast of South America. They built roads through mountains that still exist today. They developed a system of record-keeping using knotted strings called quipu, and they performed advanced surgical procedures, including brain surgery. And they managed an economy that fed millions of people across diverse climates and terrains. Again, this is not the simple life that the noble savage myth suggests. These were sophisticated civilizations with achievements that match or exceed what was happening in Europe at the same time. But the myth persisted because it served a purpose for Europeans. See, by imagining indigenous people as these innocent children of nature, Europeans could justify treating them like children. If indigenous people were too pure and simple to understand complex ideas like property ownership or government, then Europeans could step in and make decisions for them. It's patronizing in the worst way. The myth said indigenous people were good, but in a way that made them seem less than fully human, less capable of complex thought, less deserving of being taken seriously. And this had real consequences. When Europeans colonized the Americas, they used this myth to justify taking land and resources. They told themselves they were bringing civilization to people who were too simple to have their own. They destroyed complex political systems and replaced them with European ones, claiming they were doing indigenous people a favor. They banned religious practices, broke up social structures, and tried to erase languages, all while claiming they were helping these simple people become civilized. The noble savage myth gave them moral cover for what was really just conquest and theft dressed up as charity. The myth also erased the reality of indigenous warfare and conflict. Yes, indigenous nations fought wars with each other. They had territorial disputes, political rivalries, and complex alliances, just like every other human society in history. But the myth couldn't allow for that, because if indigenous people fought wars, they weren't pure and innocent anymore. So historians and storytellers just ignored it. They pretended these conflicts never happened, or they blamed them on European influence. This erasure of indigenous agency is incredibly disrespectful. It suggests that indigenous people weren't capable of making their own choices, good or bad. It treats them like props in a European morality tale rather than real people with their own histories. And it ignores the actual military and political strategies that indigenous nations developed over centuries. The environmental part of the myth is especially frustrating. Yes, many indigenous cultures had sustainable practices and deep respect for the land, but they also actively managed and shaped their environments in ways that show sophisticated ecological knowledge. They used controlled burns to manage forests and encourage certain types of growth. They hunted large animals to extinction in some cases, just like humans everywhere did. They built large cities, farmed extensively, and changed the landscape around them in deliberate ways. They were sophisticated environmental managers, not passive observers. The Amazon rainforest that people think of as pristine wilderness, it was actually shaped by indigenous people over thousands of years. They cultivated certain trees, enriched the soil, and created what scientists now call the Amazon dark earth. The forest we see today is partly a product of human management, but the noble savage myth can't handle that complexity. It needs indigenous people to be either perfect guardians who never touched nature, or destructive forces who ruined it. It can't accept that they were just people who interacted with their environment in complex ways, sometimes sustainably, and sometimes not. Just like everyone else throughout history has done with the resources available to them. This myth shows up everywhere in modern culture. Think about how indigenous characters are portrayed in movies. They're usually wise spiritual guides who show up to teach the white protagonist some deep lesson about nature. Then they disappear from the story once they've served their purpose. Or they're tragic figures who represent a lost, pure way of life that's been destroyed by modernity. Either way, they're not shown as real, complex people with their own goals and flaws. They're symbols used to make a point about modern society rather than actual characters. And this symbolism continues to hurt real indigenous people today. When people believe the noble savage myth, they expect modern indigenous people to live up to this impossible standard. If an indigenous person uses modern technology or doesn't follow traditional practices, people act like they're betraying their culture. As if indigenous cultures were supposed to freeze in time back in 1500 and never change. But cultures evolve. They always have. Indigenous people today are still indigenous, even if they drive cars and use smartphones. They're not historical artifacts or museum pieces. They're living people with living cultures that continue to grow and adapt. The myth also makes it harder for indigenous people to have their real concerns taken seriously. When people have this romantic image of indigenous cultures, they don't want to hear about modern political issues affecting indigenous communities. They want the comforting fantasy, not the complicated reality. Issues like land rights, resource extraction, sovereignty, and systemic discrimination get ignored because they don't fit the romantic narrative people prefer. So what's the truth about indigenous cultures? The truth is they were and are as diverse and complex as any other cultures in the world. Some practiced agriculture, some were nomadic, some built cities, some lived in smaller groups, depending on what made sense for their environment and resources. They had wars, peace treaties, trade networks that stretched across continents, art, science, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. They made mistakes and learned from them. They adapted to changing circumstances and developed new technologies to solve problems they faced. They were human, not symbols of purity or innocence or environmental perfection, just people trying to build good lives for themselves and their communities, succeeding sometimes and failing sometimes, but always moving forward. And recognizing that doesn't diminish indigenous cultures. It actually respects them more, because it acknowledges the real achievements of indigenous nations, the actual political systems they built that took generations to develop and refine, the genuine innovations they created through trial and error and careful observation, the real histories they lived with all the complexity and nuance that any history deserves. The noble savage myth needs to die, not because indigenous cultures weren't great, but because they were great in ways that the myth refuses to acknowledge. They deserve to be remembered for what they actually were, not what some European philosopher imagined while sitting in his study thousands of miles away. So next time you see an indigenous character in a movie or read about indigenous history, ask yourself if you're seeing the noble savage myth at play. Are indigenous people being portrayed as real, complex humans with agency and diverse perspectives? Or are they just wise spiritual guides existing to teach someone else a lesson? Because real indigenous history is so much more interesting than the myth. It's full of innovation, conflict, achievement, failure, and everything else that makes human history worth studying. If you want to learn more about actual indigenous cultures, check out the next video.